Welcome to Grandma Has ADHD, the podcast exploring the surprising, challenging, and often overlooked world of ADHD in seniors. I'm your host, Jami Shapiro, the founder of Silver Linings Transitions and an ADHD specialist. Professionally, as a senior move manager for more than 10 years, I've worked intimately with seniors challenged with decluttering and downsizing. Personally, I am the child of two ADHD parents, and I have ADHD. ADHD isn't something that goes away with age. Grandma Has ADHD is here to educate and entertain seniors and those who love them with stories of hope, resilience, and strategies, because it's never too late to understand yourself better and find your tribe. Let's get started with today's episode. I am excited, or we are excited, to welcome Dr. Joe Casciani to the Grandma Has ADHD stage. And, as typical ADHD, I forgot to turn my focus on. So, there's my squirrel for the day. We're nothing if we're not keeping it real. So welcome to Life with ADHD, Dr. Joe. I want to give you your bio first, but Dr. Joe, before I begin, is one of the only guests that we have had that does not have ADHD. So I have to explain some of these little squirrel moments. Everybody else is just like, oh yeah, I totally get it. But Dr. Joe is the host and creator of the Living to 100 Club, a website that offers a collection of strategies and resources on successful aging, as well as a weekly podcast on aging and longevity. And he also has, interestingly, a background as a psychologist in the history of aging and having worked in many capacities around aging starting in 1982. So I know Dr. Joe personally because we worked in the senior space in San Diego, and I loved the fact that he created something really to positively support people as they age. And that is one of the things that I really wanted to focus on today was aging and a diagnosis of ADHD. So with that very long introduction, hello, Dr. Joe Casciani.
Hi.
How are you? Hi. Thank you so much. Tell me a little bit about the Living to 100 Club and how that came to be.
Sure. Yeah, as you mentioned, I've worked with older adults my whole career, primarily in nursing homes, skilled nursing facilities up until about 6 years ago. And I learned a lot about psychological issues affecting seniors, especially as they decline medically, psychologically, personally. So I started the Living to 100 Club really as a source of education and inspiration about aging. So I like to say the Living to 100 Club is a great destination, but it's not in the cards for everybody. Not everyone's going to make it to 100, but my point is, let's stay positive while trying, and let's stay positive no matter what gets in the way. There's always going to be bumps and potholes. We need to stay positive. We get knocked down, we get back up, and continue to move forward, and with that positive spirit and energy and, motivation. So that's what I love to talk about, staying positive.
So that's great. How does as we were talking about before we started airing, that a lot of seniors grew up not knowing that they had ADHD. And a lot of them are discovering it, which is why I've created this podcast, because as we've discussed, ADHD is highly heritable. And a lot of us, especially middle-aged women, grew up not knowing that we had it until our children were diagnosed. And then we were focusing on our children and then maybe looking at ourselves. And now we're looking backwards at our parents. And I was sharing before the podcast that my mother, who was just on the podcast, we recorded with her the last episode. I hadn't spent a week with my mom knowing that she had ADHD until just recently. And it was eye-opening for me to observe that with a new lens. And one of the comments that she said to me is, I wish that I had known all along that I had ADHD, because it would definitely have changed the course of her life if she had had access to the treatment and the medications. But also our relationship might have been different, because there are a lot of things that aren't so great about having ADHD, like emotional dysregulation and rejection sensitive dysphoria and some things that might have been different. So Dr. Joe, we have listeners who are coming in and discovering they have ADHD. And just like you, I'm trying to provide a resource for them to really, like I say, make the rest of their lives the best of their lives. So what would your advice be to somebody who is coming into this very late discovery?
Well, let me preface this, Jamie, but I'm really not a specialist in ADHD. I consider myself a geropsychologist, but not really having a specialty in this condition. So I'd have to say, from what I understand, as a person understands or comes to learn that he or she has ADHD, it probably explains a lot of things that might have gone on in their life in terms of relationships and difficulty. So I think, part of the problem is once retirement hits, there's a kind of a loss of structure and a loss of daily routine. And I think some of these symptoms might reemerge as the structure kind of goes away. So the person starts to kind of re-experience these problems with emotional dysregulation and inattentiveness and difficulty completing tasks. So I think there's a certain recognition that comes in, maybe when a person understands that, hey, this is really ADHD, and it probably explains a lot of things about my history and maybe poor performance in some ways and relationship disruptions. So I think it kind of creates this sense of regret or remorse of, gee, why didn't I know about this earlier? Or why didn't I have some help understanding why, again, that sense of regret, why didn't I have some help? And why couldn't I have better understood why I was experiencing all these symptoms over the years? I think there's, as you say, as you reconnect with your mother and understand that there were some of these issues that kind of filtered into your relationship. I think the whole notion of understanding, being educated about this, would have made huge differences for you and for anyone else who learns about this condition later on. So there's the whole notion of good education so I can make more informed decisions about my life, whatever it is. So understanding what might have triggered or might have contributed to some of these behaviors or relationship issues or performance issues, that would have made all the difference.
Sure.
Yeah, a lot of issues.
So what do we say? I mean, I would imagine that this is a commonality with seniors too, who may not have ADHD, but are looking back on their lives. And I wish I had done this differently. I wish I had. How do you counsel them?
Well, first of all, we can't change the past, right? I always say we can look back and say, gee, I wish I had done this differently or that. We can't change that. All we can change is our perception of it. At the time, we thought we were doing the best. We thought we were doing the right thing. And if we have to do over, we would do something different. But we can't change any of that. So all we can change is our perception, the way we label or describe that past experience. So that's number one. Let go of the personal history and focus on what we have today and what I can fix today, what I can work on today. Personal history, gee, that's a heavy burden sometimes. Again, as they said, regret, remorse, a lot of things that carry into it. We got to let go of that and focus on what we have today. There are a lot of techniques for the individual who has this hyperactivity or attentive disruption problems. So let's learn what we can do today and how we can focus on relationships today and rebuild things. We don't have to change anything in the past. We can just focus on what we have today. So that's where we start. Let go of personal history, focus on today. I read a great quote by Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, Laotzu. He said, if you're depressed, you're living in the past. If you're anxious, you're living in the future. If you're at peace, you're living in the present. So let's get out of the past, let's get out of the future and focus on what I can do right now, what I can do today. So again, I understand there's one of the big controversies with ADHD is the whole notion of, is this dementia? People are kind of experiencing these symptoms of forgetfulness and memory loss and losing attention. And they're concerned that maybe I've got dementia. Maybe it's mild cognitive impairment. Maybe it's some cognitive decline. So it's a real concern. It's a real consideration. So the person ends up maybe being seen by a primary care doc or some other healthcare professional. And they say, oh, you got some cognitive deficits. You're probably heading toward dementia. So that's a risk. And we have to be careful that there are some differences. There are some unique distinctions between dementia and ADHD. We could talk about that more a little bit.
Sure. I will say that My mom was relieved actually when she realized that a lot of these little memory losses were not dementia and were actually ADHD. So you can look at that way. And I did want to just piggyback onto something that you said. I love that quote that you shared. I've heard it a lot. One of the things that I've learned in my training with ADHD is that people with ADHD have two times, now and not now. So thankfully, I think, and maybe that's why a lot of people with ADHD, not to be the toxic positivity of ADHD, but a lot of times we tend to be a little more positive. We tend to have, although a lot of us struggle with depression and anxiety, we do tend to be more optimistic. And the silver lining of ADHD is we do tend to live in what's happening in this moment right now. We don't always have a future orientation, which can also lead to problems because we don't necessarily prepare financially and other things. But yeah, I mean, I would love to discuss. I know that you're not an ADHD expert, so I don't know how much more you want to share about some of the similarities between ADHD and cognitive decline. I do want to make sure that I remember that we need to take a break to bring our sponsors in. So we're going to pause and then we'll come back to talking more about that. If you are listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you or a loved one is feeling overwhelmed by the challenges of ADHD or disorganization. Since those of us with ADHD tend to struggle with where to begin big projects like moving or home organizing, the Silver Linings Transitions team can guide you through the process, breaking tasks down into manageable steps or handling every detail. There's a reason our team carries magic wands when we work with our clients. We can pack and move your entire home and you won't have to miss a day of work or touch a single box. We also provide home organizing and storage sort-outs with an understanding of ADHD. If you have a home to sell, we can provide you free or discounted services when we refer you to one of our realtor partners through our realtor referral program. Visit our website at www.silverliningstransitions.com or call us at 760-522-1624 to learn more about how we can help you make your move or home organizational project magical. And we are back with Dr. Joe Casciani. Thanks so much for coming back to the second part of that conversation. Joe, we were talking about the distinction between ADHD and cognitive impairment, and you sort of said you wanted to come back and elaborate on that.
Sure. There are some neuropsychological tests. I did a fair amount of dementia screenings over the years. There's a certain picture that emerges, signs and symptoms. Signs are what we observe. Symptoms are what the patient experiences. Sometimes gets confused. Signs and symptoms are different. And I think one of the important distinctions is that the problems with memory and forgetfulness and inattentiveness are always present, more or less, with the ADHD person. They might subside a little bit, but they're always there in the background. And I think with dementia, early cognitive impairment, these memory problems, forgetfulness, lack of attention, irritability, they emerge later on. I mean, they're not there early on like they are with the non-demented person. So I think that's an important distinction, that when these things start to surface much later on in 50s, 60s or later, it's probably not the picture, if that makes sense. Jamie, does that make sense to you?
It absolutely does. And one of the things that I've learned is because there really isn't a true screening at this point for seniors specifically. In fact, I'm not sure that we have much screening past childhood, but that is why they encourage you to bring a spouse or a family member to answer questions, because I know even for me, I don't always see my own patterns. It's a very typical ADHD thing, but now I can look back at my experience with my mother and say, Mom, remember when you were in your 40s and I was in my 20s and this was happening? And, and so this isn't new to you aging mom. This has been going on since I can, look at my baby book as evidence of the ADHD.
Exactly.
You were
sure.
23 years old. So exactly.
Yeah, it's always been there. It's always been there, maybe brighter, maybe not as bright, but it's always been there. So, and you're right about getting some other information early on, what was going on in school, performance, all of that. So we don't remember all that stuff, but sometimes others do. Our relatives or close friends, they'll remember.
Sure.
Yeah.
So how can we reassure someone who, again, they're discovering this, they're finding it out about themselves? And I mean, let me ask you this question too. You mentioned retirement. How many seniors are discovering themselves in a new way, like are really taking the time, especially the boomers, to have a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset? And one of the things that we've discussed, and it's a little long-winded, but I think it's relevant, is this generation. My kids are in their 20s and teens, and they have something like ADHD and they're like, let my freak flag fly. Like they're very open about it versus maybe the boomers. And definitely as we go back to the silent generation and then to the greatest generation, things were kept in private. You don't share these things. And I remember when I was first doing a presentation using pictures of my mom's home, and she found out that I had done this, and she was mortified. And I'm like, well, Mom, I've been using pictures of my house. And so I had to kind of bring her out about that, because she was initially like, I don't know that I want people to know. And,
Yeah, I think that's very true. We are more accepting. It's not something that needs to be hidden. But I think that parallels the whole notion of aging in itself. The ageist attitude that getting older meant decline and dependency and helplessness. People dread it looking ahead. And nowadays we're letting go. That ageist attitude is evaporating, and we can see the upsides to aging. Let's talk about that. I've just written a whole lot about that in my card deck series. So there are upsides. So I think it parallels, like I said, the whole notion of understanding. Well, this is something that I've been carried around. This is something I can open up about. This is something I can describe to others. I can kind of learn to understand it. I can get some counseling for it. Maybe consider some medication. It's not something that I need to hide anymore. So, and again, it's letting go of that regret and remorse and kind of fault-finding attitude that we might have had from the past. Look at, well, what can I work on now? What can I fix? What can I improve? I think that's just the important consideration, that getting old is good. We stay positive. We can focus on all of the good things about aging, and recognizing that we've had some diagnosis that was maybe unidentified or undiagnosed in the past. Well, let's bring that out. Let's recognize that, because the more we suppress it, the more we keep it hidden, the more power it has over us, the more it controls us.
Right.
Just like any emotion, if we hide our anger or hide our sadness or hide our rage, it has very strong controlling effect on us.
So what would you say, by the way, I always like the expression, what you resist persists, which sort of sums up what you just said. But so what would you say are the positive parts of aging? Because, I'm aging. I mean, we're all aging, right? Justin, who thinks he's, super young, we're all aging. So what are the positive parts?
Yeah, it's just preliminary comment. It's very easy to focus on what we cannot do anymore as we get older. All we see is, the sports, the activities, the performance. We can easily dwell on, gee, I used to be able to do that, or I used to be so good at this. I used to be able, and we lose sight of what we still can do. So that being said, I've just written this series of modules, and one of the modules is on what are the opportunities that lie ahead of us? What are the positives of aging? And I got to dig into that topic a fair amount. And there are a lot of positives that we kind of dismiss, and the relationships, the factor that we can have this legacy we can leave to our successors, our children, grandchildren, others. The fact that we can start a new career, start a second career. I mean, who thinks about starting a second career? Well, there are some great websites available. The Department of Labor has this huge website called Career Finder for seniors, and looking at all of the opportunities. I mean, not just listing the jobs, but really interviewing people, showing videos, talking about salary, talking about outcomes in the future. What's the growth like in that career? So the whole idea that we have this time now, I'm not a big fan of retirement. I mean, retirement's great, but we have to say what's next. We have to say, okay, what doors do I open up? Otherwise, if we just think about golf and grandchildren, that's okay for a while. I don't need to not golf for grandchildren. We want to keep opening new doors, because that's where our purpose comes in. That's where our meaning comes in. That's where our excitement, our energy comes in. I read a few books by this guy, Joe Dispenza. He's this kind of new age guru now. Mm-hmm. Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself is one of the titles. Mm-hmm. It's all about letting go of that safe, familiar comfort zone and saying, okay, how do I break that habit of being myself and start new career. So legacy, the wisdom, the relations, the opportunity for spirituality and transcendence and taking time to reflect and maybe dig deeper into life and afterlife, all of these issues. So there's great opportunities, much more, I'd say, richer opportunities than when we were middle-aged adults. So I can go on and on about that. But
no, I love that. I love that. And I'm so glad you brought that up. I want to put that in the show notes, the career finder, because one of the things that I have learned is that retirement is not good for people with ADHD because boredom is our kryptonite. I was listening to a webinar this morning with Penn. I can't think of the family name, but they do all these really fun ADHD. He just came out with the book ADHD is Awesome. And he was talking specifically, he calls it not boredom, but I don't remember, but he really goes into great length about, and it's true how painful boredom is for people with ADHD. So that is such an amazing, and I love that you touched on spirituality. That's one of my favorite, especially, but don't have time to go into that because we decided specifically to keep these segments at under a half an hour because people with ADHD have a short attention span. But I do want to make sure, you mentioned your card games, and I want to make sure that we talk about, how people can find you and what you offer through both Living to 100 Club and, Dr. Joe Casciani.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamie. Yeah. So I have a website, livingto100.club, not .com or .org, but
thank
.club.
you.
One of those upper level domain. And it's a collection of blogs that I've written. Yes, I'm almost 6 years into my podcasting, and in June, it'll be 6 years, 200 plus episodes. And I do public speaking and do some support groups with senior communities. And I love to talk about staying positive as we get older. So my big project, I won't say it's my last hurrah, but my big project is this series of training modules called Better, Longer, and Happier, a guide to aging with purpose and positive. It's a series of 12 modules or card decks. I'm going to grab one quickly. This is number 2.
Yep. Nice.
Guide to aging with purpose and positive. This is all about age is only number. So there's cards, 60 cards in each deck, activities, inspirational stories, links to videos. It's a massive project and I'm really proud of it. So people can go to my website, livingto100.club/BLA.
I would love for you to pull a card now and let's all of us answer it.
Oh, well, again.
Can we do that?
No, it's not like that. It's so there's knowledge, you've got activities and exercises. So, if you're a program director,
got it.
Life enhancement director, lifestyle director, you're going to pull out these activities, or you're going to pull out, one of the videos, TED Talks, YouTube video. There's, as I said, 60 cards in each deck. So team in each of 4 sections. Great information. Somebody doesn't have to do any preparation.
Nice.
Research is all done. And I think it's going to really, the goal is to help seniors in these communities stay positive and stay psychologically minded about aging well, rather than just to diminish diet, exercise, and all that. Those are great wellness programs. And what happens when we have those setbacks, and how do we stay positive in the face of setback? That's what I'm all about.
Great.
So that's how
okay, that makes sense now. I do have one quick question that I'm going to spring on you. And I have heard that the happiest time in a person's life is their late 60s. Is that what you have experienced or understand?
I've heard something similar to that. Then I've heard something that counters that argument, that we don't have that. So I have heard consistently that happiness increases as we age.
That's awesome. That is awesome.
Isn't that great?
That's helpful. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Speaking as someone who's now in my mid 50s. Yes. Any other parting? Good. That is amazing. Any parting words for us or anything that you want to share with our listeners before we say goodbye?
Yeah, just quickly, one piece of advice I like to give is be careful how we interpret events that come along in our life. It's very easy to label something as negative, and we get stuck in that negative interpretation. So be very careful that if we interpret it in a positive way, it means we can cope with it better. If we interpret it in a negative way, it means it's going to be a heavy burden. So just be careful how we interpret these events, no matter what they are.
That's great. That's super helpful. Justin, do you have anything you want to share? I know we kept you quiet most of the interview today.
No, and that's okay. But no, I don't have anything to add, but that's some great life advice at the end. It's because a lot of times you're right. You do start to drown in the negativity and always think the worst. kind of take a more positive outlook. Good advice. Good advice.
And people with ADHD, just so you know, tend to catastrophize. So that's why a lot of people do have anxiety with ADHD because our brains are just spinning. And actually, we had Alan P. Brown, who is the ADD crusher, on, and he said that he gave that voice in his head, that negative self-talk, a New Jersey accent and tells him to go away. I'm like, perfect. Yeah. So, well, thank you so much to Dr. Joe Casciani, who joined us today on Grandma Has ADHD. As we like to say, we want to make the rest of your life the best of your life. And I couldn't think of a better guest to really embody that than Dr. Joe.
Thank you very much for the invite, Jamie. I enjoyed being here.
Thank you. The opinions expressed on Grandma Has ADHD podcast are those of our guests and hosts and are intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This podcast does not provide medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content discussed in this episode is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, mental health professional, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental health concern. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or emergency services immediately. The host, guests, and producers of Grandma Has ADHD do not assume any liability for the content of this podcast. Listen at your own discretion.